Bob Dylan kept a secret for 60 years, and when he finally let it go, everything about his life snapped into focus. The motorcycle crash, the born-again phase, the vanishing acts at the exact height of his fame, none of it was random. None of it was madness. Every move traced back to something he never wanted the world to see. Robert Allen Zimmerman arrived on May 24, 1941, in Duluth, Minnesota, born into a small Jewish community in a state that barely knew it existed. When Bob was 6, his father contracted polio, and the family relocated to Hibbing, a mining town carved out of frozen iron country where foghorns from nearby Duluth drifted across the cold like warnings. It was the kind of place that either crushed a person or made them desperate to escape. And Bob felt that pressure early. He had asthma, spent long stretches alone, and carried a family history that stretched back to Ukraine and Lithuania. People who had survived places that didn't want them, and that sense of inherited weight would show up in his music long before anyone knew to look for it. Rock and roll found him first, around age 10, when Elvis Presley and Hank Williams came through the radio. Hank's voice hit Bob like something physical. He described it as an electric shock, and the morning after hearing it, he sat at his family's piano and started playing by ear, working out chords nobody had taught him. His family ran local movie theaters, which meant Bob grew up watching performers on screen, studying how they held a crowd. By 14, he'd switched to guitar, and by high school he'd formed a band called the Golden Chords, playing loud and fast until a school principal allegedly cut the microphone during a talent show. His high school yearbook listed his ambition as joining Little Richard, and he meant it. Little Richard had everything Bob wanted: the chaos, the costumes, the physical electricity of someone who seems genuinely dangerous on stage. He'd already started building his own persona by then, telling classmates he was an orphan from New Mexico, spinning fabrications just to see if people would believe them. When he moved to Minneapolis in 1959 and enrolled at the University of Minnesota, the stories grew wilder. He introduced himself as Bob Dylan, possibly from the poet Dylan Thomas, possibly from a cowboy on television. Nobody ever settled it, and started performing at coffee houses in Dinkytown for a few dollars a night. The shift that defined his early career came from a single book. Someone handed him Woody Guthrie's autobiography, Bound for Glory, and within weeks he'd put down the electric guitar, picked up an acoustic, and started writing songs that belonged to folk music in a way nothing he'd done before had. In January of 1961, 19 years old, Bob stepped off a bus in New York City with a guitar and a suitcase, and one specific plan: find Woody Guthrie. Guthrie was dying in a psychiatric hospital in New Jersey, losing ground to Huntington's disease. But Dylan made the trip and talked his way into a visit. Guthrie handed him a note that read, "I ain't dead yet." Dylan went home and wrote Song to Woody, borrowing the melody from Guthrie's own 1913 Massacre, which was exactly how the folk tradition worked, passing things down. And that song became one of just 2 originals on his debut album. John Hammond at Columbia Records signed Dylan in October 1961, after seeing something in him that nearly everyone else at the label missed. They called him Hammond's Folly. The recording sessions cost $42 across 3 afternoons. Dylan refused to stay close to the microphone, popped every P, hissed every S, and flatly refused second takes. And the album barely sold 5,000 copies in its first year. Hammond didn't flinch. The person who pulled his writing into a different dimension was Suze Rotolo, whose parents had been members of the Communist Party and who had grown up surrounded by political thought and activism. By early 1962, they were living together in Greenwich Village, and she was introducing him to poetry, foreign films, and avant-garde theater. Masters of War and The Death of Emmett Till came out of that period. Not simply protest music, but something colder and more precise. The two of them appeared arm in arm on the cover of the freewheelin' Bob Dylan, looking like any young couple on a New York City street. But by 1964, the relationship had fractured under the weight of a fame that only kept growing. Greenwich Village in those years was the center of the folk music world, and Dylan absorbed everything the scene had. He played Gertie's Folk City, Café Wa, The Bitter End, surviving on cold apartments and borrowed sweaters, and the electric feeling that something was about to break open. By the summer of 1963, when he took the Newport Folk Festival stage at 22 alongside Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and the Freedom Singers, Billboard magazine called it the most powerful moment of the festival. Baez had already been a star when they met, and she carried Dylan onto her stages and championed his songs before most audiences knew his name. Together they performed at the March on Washington, just before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his speech, and that proximity to history felt entirely natural for Dylan at that moment. The times they are a-changin'. Released in 1964 into a country cracked open by the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the rising pressure of the civil rights movement, charted at number 9 in the United Kingdom and found new listeners with every decade that followed. But even as that version of Dylan was reaching its peak, he was already somewhere else. LSD had entered his life. He was reading Rimbaud, and his lyrics were turning surreal, less about pointing at systems and more about painting something that couldn't be pinned down. During a recording session that June, he drank wine and cut 14 songs in 3 hours, and that became another side of Bob Dylan, a clear signal that the protest era was closing. Bringing It All Back Home, released in 1965, opened with Subterranean Homesick Blues, and within seconds the folk world understood something had changed permanently. The first side was electric, full band, drums, while the second stayed acoustic. But the lyrics throughout had grown stranger than anything he'd committed to record before. Like a Rolling Stone followed, 6 minutes long at a time when radio singles ran under 3, and record executives despised it before a single fan heard it. A copy ended up at a New York club. The crowd demanded it again and again until the vinyl wore out, and by the next morning, radio stations were calling to beg for copies. Paul McCartney said it sounded like it could go on forever. The organ sound that defined the track came from Al Cooper, a 21-year-old guitarist who slipped behind the organ during a session he'd only been invited to watch, playing only the chords he was certain of and staying quiet when he wasn't. That hesitation built the delay in the notes. Dylan heard it, told them to turn it up, and an accident became iconic. At the Newport Folk Festival that same year, Dylan plugged in, opened with Maggie's Farm backed by electric guitar and organ, and the crowd split, some cheering, others booing, Pete Seeger reportedly ready to cut the power cables with an axe. Dylan played 3 songs and walked off. He wouldn't return to Newport for 37 years. The Manchester show in 1966 produced the other moment everyone carried. Midway through the electric set, a voice from the crowd shouted one word: Judas. Dylan leaned into the microphone and replied, "I don't believe you. You're a liar." Then he turned to the band, told them to play it loud, and like a rolling stone tore through the hall. Dylan married Sarah Lowndes under an oak tree on Long Island that same year, quietly, with almost none of his friends present. She had a daughter, Maria, whom Dylan adopted, and together they had 4 more children. Blonde on Blonde came out of late-night Nashville sessions running on coffee and momentum, and the opening track, Rainy Day Women, number 12 and 35, existed because Dylan asked if they could bring in an actual Salvation Army band after his producer joked that a new song sounded like one. They did. The 1966 World Tour nearly finished him. Every night was split, acoustic first, electric after, and every night the crowd fractured along the same fault lines. Robbie Robertson later said Dylan looked like he was physically falling apart. One night he nearly drowned in a hotel bathtub. On July 29, 1966, he went down on his motorcycle near Woodstock, with no ambulance report, no hospital record, and Dylan himself later hinting the crash gave him the exit he was looking for. He disappeared, and for months the only music he made was in the basement of a pink house in Woodstock, with the group that would become the band. Blood on the Tracks arrived in 1975, and whatever Dylan claimed about its origins, His son Jacob later said plainly that the album was about his parents. Dylan re-recorded half of it after his brother gave the original version a lukewarm response, and what came out became one of the most affecting breakup albums in rock music history. The Rolling Thunder review followed. Not just a tour, but a traveling circus of poets, playwrights, and musicians, with Dylan in white face paint. One night in 1975, Sarah came to the studio and Dylan told the band to play, turned toward her, and sang Sarah with her standing just on the other side of the glass. Everyone in the room went silent. They reconciled briefly, but in 1977 Sarah came downstairs one morning to find another woman sitting in her house with her husband and children. Court documents described erratic behavior and fear. The marriage ended. Sarah walked away with half of everything, including rights to the songs written during their years together, and a settlement clause required her silence, which she has kept ever since. In 1978, at a concert in San Diego, someone threw a small silver cross onto the stage, and Dylan picked it up. The following night, alone in a hotel room in Tucson, he described feeling Jesus physically touch him. He was baptized, enrolled in Bible study, released a gospel album, abandoned his old catalog, and began preaching between songs about the end times. Outside venues, people sold their $15 tickets for $5. By 1983, Infidels marked a gradual return. Recorded with Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits, Dylan turned down both David Bowie and Frank Zappa for the sessions. And though a stunning recording called Blind Willie McTell was left off the final album entirely, it still went gold in the United States and cracked the top 10 in the United Kingdom and Norway. In 1986, Dylan had a daughter with his backup singer, Carolyn Dennis. They married in Los Angeles, sealed the certificate under a legal provision, and left his name off the birth certificate. The secret held until a biography broke it in 2001. His albums in that period, Knocked Out Loaded and Down in the Groove, were later called the lowest points of his catalog, rushed and unfocused, one of them earning the reputation as his worst album ever. Then George Harrison called. Tom Petty agreed. Roy Orbison and Jeff Lynne came on board, and together the five of them recorded under the name The Traveling Wilburys, taking goofy aliases and playing like people who had nothing left to prove. The album won a Grammy. For Dylan, the whole thing was proof of something he hadn't been entirely certain of, that the music was still there, still alive, and that whatever came next wasn't the end.